Since I had already proven that there's a correlation between the stories of the prophets Elijah and Elisha and the events of the book of Acts, I didn't want to go into proving that in this video. Instead, I wanted to examine the events of the prophets' lives that came before. That earlier proof of the correlation I made in the video called The Two Witnesses. The story of Elijah begins actually in 1 Kings 17 verse 1, and we did not begin the correlation in Acts until Elijah was victorious on Mount Carmel, which came a little bit later. So a very important thing which comes up now in the story of Elijah, which we can probably, I think, easily correlate with something in all of the Gospels, is how Elijah is fed by the ravens here in this part. There is a correlation between the ravens and John the Baptist. And as we know, the Baptist story begins every gospel. And there's a reason for that, because it's when Yahweh came into the world. When we see the story that's actually being portrayed, whose story it is, as we go through these correlations, that's important to keep in mind. The cross-reference, to realize that the story of the raven is about John the Baptist, is the story of Noah and how he releases the raven first and then the dove. So we have the instance of John represented by the raven, because we see that Jesus at his baptism is represented by how the dove fell on him. The idea is that the story of Noah is not really about the flood. The story of Noah is about how God had to use Israel like the ark, with using the law and everything else, to be able to address man. In other words, to have a place, because the world had become too complicated for Yahweh. After that, the Father had breathed him out onto Adam, and then Adam and Eve had sinned, partaking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It got too complex for Yahweh. He wasn't really made to deal with that. And so he was ready to, the floodwaters were finishing up, and that's why you had John and Jesus represented in the raven and the dove this way, because it was all coming to some sort of resolution, and Yahweh was doing something different. All right, so next we have this story about Elijah and the widow at Zarephath. And we can see that there's a woman, and she must mean something symbolically, because everything in this correlations, when it comes to characters, seems to mean something. Yeah, we see it's not just Elijah and the widow, but it's Elijah and the widow and her son, right? So if we wise up and realize that the woman represents the religion, there's something about this that is important in terms of what arguments are talked about over Christianity and its origins today. And that was Jesus and a scene. And that this um, uh, little vignette suggests rather heavily that he may have been, meaning that the woman was the Essene religion, um, or Nazarene, or whatever uh, particular thing that it seems like Jesus might have belonged to, but that it could be very important. Um, uh, People like Aaron Abke, for instance, have been arguing this point for a while, and this is something that reinforces his argument. Certainly, the raising of both this widow's son from the dead by Elijah and the Shunammite's by Elisha suggests that the correlations are based in the that we see running through Acts are based in time, so that chronologically we know that they evolve from that similar um, thing, which is, as we looks too obvious, it's the resurrection of Jesus. In neither case are we expected to follow uh, the child who was raised from the dead and go away from the prophet. In neither case, in other words, is Jesus meant to be made into the object. We're supposed to keep our eyes on what Yahweh is doing. The story is Yahweh's story and not Jesus' story. It's very interesting how the subtext refuses to let that go. So the next thing that happens after the child is raised is that Elijah um, comes to Obadiah and says, I'm going to present myself to Ahab, and Obadiah is like, no, you can't do that, blah, 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 because, Ahab will kill me because, you're not going to do it. But then Elijah says, yes, I surely will, and all this. Because this whole thing is, Obadiah is like Jesus after he's been resurrected. And he talks about to Elijah how he kept the two groups of the prophets in different caves, because what this is about is how when he was alive, he actually had the two, because we're talking about in Acts, it's a double portion, right? It's fulfillment of the walking of the double portion, first in Elijah and then in Elisha. And so then we have this same thing in Jesus. And so as the voice of Obadiah, as the post-resurrection Jesus, you have this talking about that. But Obadiah doesn't carry it forth from there. Elijah does. And then Elijah proceeds to have the victory on Mount Carmel, which we saw in the correlation in Acts is equivalent to the outpouring of the Spirit at Pentecost. And we go from there. We have a whole cascade of things which happen, which are in tune with the prophet's story, and they all form a subtext which has an entirely different meaning, because it's a subtext which is intended to tell us whose story these things are really about, and that is Yahweh's story, not Jesus' story. Yahweh being able to die with the vessel, Jesus, when he died, so that he could go back to the Father and be changed. And then at the outpouring, when he was, he's the Lamb now, right? As characterized in the book of Revelation, when we see him, that he's got the 7 eyes and the 7 horns, or the 7 spirits of God, which it's Yahweh and Jesus are one. And, but you shouldn't just see Jesus, you need to see Yahweh, because this is his insisting that you do by telling it this way, and then the correlation. And it is actually to tell you something about, having gotten the orientation of what Christianity is wrong. That, it's not like Paul said. Paul really kind of filled in what must have been a vacuum, because this teaching wasn't there. I mean, it may have been there amongst the early members of the way and all that, but it certainly didn't make it to us, except in these hidden ways. Yeah. That is so interesting that they would hide it like this. But, this is pretty obvious, actually, when you do find it and see it, and it's there. And I got to wonder why why was it left until now? I mean, I'm like the last backstop. Some scholars should have found this. And it not least which should have been found a long time ago rather than all the way till now. It's so interesting, the timing of all this. I love how the elegant nature of it suggests that it's God speaking to man, but how you can also see, just use literary criticism, you can see that it could just be scholars, talking to each other throughout the centuries. It's a little difficult to see that specifically, more specifically than it being God talking, because there would have to be no hint of that communication to us now. It would have to have all been destroyed somehow throughout in history, and yet still perpetrated upon us in these stories. Whereas God talking to us and hiding it and having it come out now makes more sense in lots of ways. Meaning that if it were scholars, it should have been found, because the usual scholarly things should have unveiled it, you would have thought. And, all that whole correlation throughout Acts being much more potent of a thing than what we've just gone through in this video. But this alone also tells, and grounds us and orients us and tells us some things one way or another. Not that, it helps you have any kind of a personal relationship with God or anything like that. It just helps a person. Say if you're wounded by what evangelical Christianity might have done to you, but there's got to be some truth. You can come here and you can say, yeah, it doesn't help me, do anything inside myself, but it sure helps me get the exterior arguments that have not made any sense a little bit more correct, so that, yeah, some things do make sense, and I can see why it would be like that, and how come. Yeah, because maybe I have lived several lives, and maybe I am getting better all the time. Maybe I'm learning from all that. I don't know. We have to admit that we don't know. Not be so sure in that way that we've always been sure and hurt so many people.